Welcome to the Jacob Hornberger Show. Nice to be back with y'all. Have y'all heard about this coin trick that the statists are now proposing? This thing is really hilarious, and it really goes to show you the mindset of the welfare statist. I mean, this thing is the welfare state has this. This is the culmination, really, of the welfare state. This little coin trick that they're proposing. Well, really, the welfare warfare state, because that's where they're spending, all this money. The more than $3 trillion, a third of it that they can't raise in taxes. They're scared to raise taxes because people get mad. So they end up borrowing, $1 trillion every year. They keep mounting it onto the debt that we, the taxpayers, are expected to pay. I mean, that's the thing to keep in mind. They keep saying, "Oh, it's the government's debt," or when we were little, they would say, "Oh, well, it doesn't really count because we owe it to ourselves." Like we're like one massive beehive, and we're all working here for the common good and so forth, and so we all just owe it to ourselves. Well, it's ridiculous. You have the bondholders, the people that are owed this money because the money was borrowed from them, and they expect to be paid. And the only way they have to pay these people back is by confiscating money through taxation. That means the IRS. And right now, your share, everybody's share, is around $50,000. You got four people in your family, you owe more than $200,000. Now, you may not carry it on your balance sheet, but that liability is there. And so it's gotten so large, the government's debt, that Congress finally enacted a debt ceiling and said, look, enough's enough. That will let you borrow up to this point, and then that's it. No more debt will be saddled onto the American people. And yet they continue saddling more debt. They continue borrowing. And so now, the debt ceiling is coming up again. I mean, they've already reached it, really. The Treasury Department's doing some financial finagling to try to buy some time. But, the Republicans are claiming that they're going to stand fast. Well, of course, they're not going to do that. They're going to cave. They always cave. They believe in the welfare warfare state. But it's interesting to watch the statists get panicky about this thing. I mean, they are truly getting nervous over the possibility that this time the Republicans will say, no more debt. We told you this last time. You didn't believe us. You didn't do anything. In fact, when the debt ceiling was raised a couple of years ago, what that meant was, obviously, that the Congress was saying, okay, we will let you borrow some more. We will let you add on to the debt. But then that's it. There's your new ceiling. And of course, this was after Obama and all the statists, the mainstream press was saying, "Oh, chicken little, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. If the government has to work within its means, we're going to go over cliffs, and the Mayan calendar is going to come due." I mean, all these scary tactics, Y2K, etc. And so the Republicans caved. But what was interesting about this, and this is the way it's worked every time, Obama and the statists just laughed, because you would think they would say, okay, they let us borrow a little bit more money. Well, it's actually a lot more money. But now, we have to now slash spending, even to the point where taxes equal expenditures, in order to be prepared that when we keep borrowing this money, we're going to reach the new debt ceiling. They didn't do that. They just laughed. They laughed at how they were able to pull off another increase in the debt ceiling. This was a couple of years ago. And they just continued spending more money and borrowing more money. They didn't do anything to rein in the borrowing or the spending. Because why? Because they figured they'd do it again. All the scary stories of, oh, the sky's going to fall if a major portion of the welfare warfare state has to, shut down and get dismantled. Well, this is nonsense. I mean, as we libertarians have said over and over again, this is the best thing that could ever happen to the American people, to the economy. It's the same thing in Cuba, North Korea, where they have huge government sectors. The thing you need to do is just dismantle those government sectors. Does that cause dislocation for those that are on the dole, that are in the government sector? Sure. But they reorient into the private sector, because now all that money that's being sucked out of the private sector to fund these people no longer is being sucked out, whether it's sucked out by borrowing or sucked out by taxes. So it's actually a doubly positive effect. Not only does the private sector get to keep its money, but the public sector is now, those people who were in the public sector are now in the private sector producing. So you got double production now, and that's what increases standards of living. So we're coming up against the debt ceiling. The Republicans claim, or at least some Republicans claim, we're not caving this time. We're not caving this time. Of course, they're saying we want Obama to agree to spending cuts as a part of raising the debt ceiling. Well, their spending cuts are ridiculous. Even if Obama were to strike a deal and he says, I'm not going to negotiate over spending cuts, I'm going to continue spending and borrowing and spending and borrowing, because he knows the Republicans are scared to death of the mainstream media when they start saying, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, portions of the federal government can no longer operate, oh gosh, disaster, and all this nonsense. So the Republicans are saying, well, we want spending cuts as part of this, but even that's ridiculous, because whenever Obama agrees to these things, the spending cuts are like 10 years from now, and the tax increases that Obama always gets are right now. I mean, that's what Republicans call negotiating, But okay, what's the libertarian position on this? Well, don't increase the debt ceiling at all. I mean, here's the chance that Republicans have that they say they always want. They say they want a balanced budget. You remember the balanced budget amendment, that they favor a balanced budget amendment? All right, well, what's that mean? That simply means that what they're collecting in taxes, they put out in expenditures. There's your balance. You collect $1 trillion in taxes, you spend $1 trillion. You collect $2 trillion in taxes, you spend $2 trillion. But you don't spend more than what you're bringing in. That's a balanced budget. Here's your chance. You see, if they don't agree to the debt ceiling increase, then Obama can't borrow any more money. The debt ceiling's been reached, so he has no choice. There's no more borrowing, at least not new debt. That means that he has to live off of the monies that are coming in terms of taxes. In other words, taxes will equal expenditures. What will that mean? He has to stop expenditures in other areas. Now, people say, oh, well, that's challenging the debt. That's challenging the public debt. No, it's not. Because you got tax revenues coming in to the tune of some $2 trillion. You can use those tax revenues to pay the debt, as it's coming due, the current debt. And now, does that mean you have to cut elsewhere? Yeah, you got to cut $1.3 trillion or so out of expenditure immediately. Okay, that means you got to start laying people off. It may mean you got to bring troops home from Korea, discharge them into the private sector. It may mean you cut welfare programs in half. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, foreign aid to dictators. There's one that could go. DEA. Farm subsidies. There's a whole wide gamut of welfare programs that would have to be cut. But isn't that what governors and mayors do on a state and local basis when they're faced with a shortfall of taxes? They start slashing. And that's what Obama would have to do. He'd have to slash $1.3 trillion. That means, a lot of defense contractors. No more contracts, boys and girls. You got to go now out in the private sector to get your business. Maybe cutting off suppliers on all these luxurious bases around the world that the Pentagon has. Maybe closing some of those bases. Whatever it takes. They got to cut $1.3 trillion. But the budget's balanced. No more new debt. It's really the ideal situation. Will there be dislocations? Of course. When you've got a huge public sector that's dependent, on confiscatory taxes and borrowing, that large portion of that public sector is going to be dismantled. Now, is that the ideal from a libertarian standpoint? This, $1.3 trillion in expenditures? No, it's not enough for us. We don't want a downsized DEA or a downsized Social Security, Medicare, farm subsidies program. We don't want less aid to foreign dictators. We don't want less aid to anybody. We want to terminate these programs, because the way we look at it is we ask a question that neither Republicans nor Democrats ever ask. And that is, what is the role of government in a free society? And once you determine that the role of government is not to punish people for ingesting harmful substances in the privacy of their own homes or their purchase or sale of such substances. And it's not to take money from one group of people in order to give it to another group of people. That's just not the role of government. It's not the role to have bases all over the world and invade and occupy and torture and create the conditions for this perpetual war on terrorism and all this. So we would say dismantle these programs. Don't just cut them by $1.3 trillion. But certainly from a fiscal standpoint, there's nothing better that could happen than they don't raise that debt ceiling. And some of the Republicans, as I say, have intimated that that's what they're going to do this time. I don't believe it, because there's believer in, and they believe in the welfare warfare state as much as Democrats and liberals. Now, what's this coin trick? Well, this coin trick says, okay, President Obama, if they don't raise the debt ceiling, you can have the Treasury create a $1 trillion coin, like a silver coin. And then the Treasury will have that as an asset, and then it can start spending money based on that asset. In other words, print the money. I mean, what they're really saying, the state, is, that they are so morally corrupt, economically corrupt, politically corrupt. I mean, this is the kind of chicanery that they are now coming up with their beloved welfare warfare state. They're really just saying, come up with a trick that'll trick the American people into thinking that all this is legitimate and just start printing the money. And in other words, massive debasement of the currency, which is really what they've done ever since the 1930s. When the welfare state was officially adopted as the new way of life in America. I mean, it was a revolutionary change. They abandoned gold and silver coins as the official money of the American people. They made it a felony to own gold coins. Can you imagine? This was the official money of the country for more than 100 years. It was the official money established by the founding fathers, by the framers. And they made it a felony offense. And then they just, decade after decade, just print the money. I mean, that's what the Federal Reserve's for, to just print the money to accommodate massive welfare warfare spending. Because every decade, they always spend more than what they're bringing in. But most people don't know about what inflation is. They think it's rising prices. They think it's some store, that's raising his prices of his clothing items, or a gasoline establishment raising gasoline prices. Remember when they were blaming it all on OPEC and stuff back in the 70s? Well, no, this is just debasement of the currency. It's what the Fed has done ever since 1913 when the Fed was established. That's its purpose. And that's why the value of this paper dollar, but it's called a Federal Reserve note. I mean, that's interesting, right? What's it promising to pay if it's a note? It doesn't promise to pay anything. And it's worth about 5% of what the dollar was worth in 1913. And that's just not something, that happens through history, like, evolution or something. No, this is deliberate policy on the part of the Federal Reserve, which, is the federal government. And that's what these statists are saying now. Okay, they're saying the American people are sick and tired of debt. They don't want any more debt. They're telling the congressmen no more debt. The congressmen are simply saying no more debt. I mean, they're the ones that set the debt ceiling, and they're doing it because it's a threat. It's a threat to our economic well-being and essentially our freedom too, here in the private sector, that we the citizens. So the statists are saying, well, here's a little coin trick we can do on the American people. Let's print this gigantic, $1 trillion coin, and then the Fed can print money based on it has more assets than it thought. This is just morally degenerate. Now, my understanding is that Obama's saying, no, we're not going to engage in this chicanery. We're not going to do this trickery on the American people, much to his credit. Because why? Because now we don't know what's going to happen if this really does come push to shove and the Republicans were to all of a sudden, get some backbone and refuse to raise the debt ceiling. We don't know what Obama would do. Some of his supporters are saying, well, just spend the money anyway and claim that this is that the debt ceiling is unconstitutional because it's challenging the public debt. Again, more chicanery. It's ridiculous. The debt ceiling doesn't challenge anything. All it says is that the total amount of debt will not exceed this amount. But there's still $2 trillion in tax revenues coming in. You can use that money to pay the debt. So the fact that the Congress says This is the maximum amount of debt this government will incur. That's not challenging the debt at all. It's just simply saying no more debt. Now, I understand also that President Obama has rejected that line of thinking. I think he recognizes it's chicanery, it's trickery, and so he's playing hardball. He's saying, no, I'm going to spend. I got a right to spend. I'm a president, and I'm going to spend and borrow and spend and borrow. And let me tell you something. They let's say they get by this debt ceiling, raise it again for 2 years from now, they will spend out the gazoo. Nothing's going to stop these people from spending and borrowing. But here's an opportunity. You see, here's an opportunity to put a stop to it right here and now, because nothing else will. Obviously, if they vote to increase the debt ceiling, they're just going to keep spending and borrowing. They're not promising to rein in spending. Obama's saying the exact opposite. He's not going to negotiate. He's going to get there, and he wants the debt ceiling raised without conditions. And they're going to laugh. They're going to laugh again. Now, as this thing starts getting closer, watch the mainstream press. The sky's going to fall in. The Mayan calendar is going to come back. The Y2K is going to be here. I mean, everything horrible. But always remind yourself that this is what they would tell the Cuban government. If people went into Cuba and said, hey, why don't you dismantle this whole government sector here that's impoverished your people? North Korea is another example. The American statists would say, oh, no, don't do it. Don't do it. Your public sector is your key to your prosperity. Hire more people in the public sector. Spend more money. Print the money. And, of course, that's the cause of their poverty. So that's where the welfare warfare state has brought us, though, with its coin trick, chicanery. I mean, it's just moral debauchery. And it really reflects where this welfare warfare state has brought us. And, a large part of this thing is the foreign policy, the military-industrial complex. Now, notice what the statists tell us. They say, oh, without the welfare state, everybody would starve to death, and everybody would be evil and mean and greedy and selfish, and there would be no charity, and there would be no prosperity, because the welfare state's the key to prosperity, and because people are spending their welfare. This is nonsense. This is the cause of impoverishment. I mean, if you look at Cuba and North Korea, it's because they have their welfare state. They have Social Security. They have Medicare. They have subsidies. They have income taxation. They have all these things. They just have a lot more of it. Their government sector is just a lot larger than ours. But the military is part of this government sector. And the government takes the position, or the military does, and the CIA, that without their sector, America would not be safe. Their little so-called favorite term, national security, a term that absolutely means nothing. It's not in the Constitution. It means whatever they want it to mean. And they say, oh, we wouldn't stand. The communists would conquer us, and the terrorists would take over the public schools and run the highways and run Washington. And there'd be terrorist members of Congress. And this is all just fear-mongering. I mean, but they've got to do it. I mean, they've got to make people think that without the warfare state, the hundreds of bases overseas, the invasions, the occupations, that America just wouldn't stand. And that without the welfare state, everybody would be evil, greedy, and dying in the streets. Well, none of that's true. The worst thing, but that's where they started borrowing huge amounts of money to invade Afghanistan, to invade Iraq. Well, they're getting ready. They'd love to invade Iran too. I mean, part of the reason they're probably not invading Iran is because they know that they don't have the money. But raises debt ceiling, who knows? But in any event, they invaded Afghanistan, Iraq. They didn't have the courage to just raise taxes to pay for. This was going to be an additional debt because they were already spending more than what they were bringing in. So they said, oh well, let's just go out and borrow more money. And of all the immoral things, they go to the Chinese communists. Imagine that. The Chinese communists are now the premier foreign creditor of the United States. Do you ever think you'd see that day? And we libertarians at the Future of Freedom Foundation, we were saying the worst thing you could do is treat this 9/11 attack as a military problem, especially one involving an invasion of a country. That, for one thing, you're going to kill a lot of innocent people. That is, kill a lot of people that had nothing to do with 9/11, because that's the way the military works. Now, people say, oh, Well, the pro-war people say, oh, well, if the Afghan government was behind us, we had to invade to effect regime change there. Nonsense. There has never been any evidence produced whatsoever that the Afghan government was involved in the 9/11 attacks. In fact, the best proof that it wasn't was that after the attacks, George W. Bush goes to the United Nations and asks for permission. He asks for a coalition authorization to invade Afghanistan. Now, if this had been a Pearl Harbor attack, did Roosevelt go out to other countries and say, I'd like permission to defend America from the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor? Of course not. It's well recognized that when one country attacks another country, you got a right to defend yourself. So if they really believed that the Afghan government had participated in the 9/11 attacks, they would have never gone to the United Nations. They wouldn't have delayed all those months trying to get a UN resolution. And the fact is that they asked the Afghan government to extradite bin Laden. And they said, well, show us some evidence. Even though there's no extradition agreement between the two countries, the Afghan government said, show us your evidence. We will take a look at it. And we will certainly send him to, at least to a neutral tribunal. They said, we don't have to show you anything. You either turn him over or we invade and we oust you from power. And that was why, that's how they justified the invasion, based on an extradition that didn't take place and without an extradition agreement. And then look how many people they've killed. I mean, they've been there 12 years and they're still not finished. And now they're in a real pickle now because they say they want to get out by 2014. But if they're still terrorists there, how do they justify this? Isn't this the way that they've justified an occupation of Afghanistan for 12 years? That the terrorists are there, the war on terrorism? Well, how do they justify now getting out in 2014 if there's still terrorists there? If there's still a war on terrorism. So you see now some of them are saying, well, the war on terrorism, it's dying down. Well, yeah, it may be finally over. Oh gosh, after 14 years, which 2014 is finally be over. Well, you see that's where they're being led, because they're not going to look real good when they've been killing and dying there since 2001 or so, under the aura that there's terrorists there. And then Iraq, I mean, it's just an absolute horrible mess there. And so it's so interesting to see the neocons jumping into this thing. I mean, the neocons, they're proud of what happened in Iraq. I mean, you see, because theirs always was a cost-benefit analysis. They said, well, let's see how many people are killed. No, they didn't say that, because they didn't care how many people were killed. They said any number of people killed in Iraq is worth the effort to effect regime change and bring democracy to this land. I mean, can you think of anything more immoral than that? I mean, what religion authorizes the killing of human beings for the sake of regime change? I mean, it absolutely boggles the mind. And this was after hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children had been killed with the sanctions in an attempt to get rid of Saddam Hussein and install a pro-US regime. But what's really funny is now in this Hagel fight, you've got the neocons, Republicans, attacking Hagel, a Republican, because they're saying he's not sufficiently neocon. He doesn't take an unconditional support of the Israeli government position. He doesn't favor invasions and occupations for the sake of regime change. He takes care about killing other people in wars. He was a Vietnam veteran. And of course, one of the things that ticked him off is that Hagel told him back in the Iraq war days that they were real brave about sending American troops into war when they themselves had escaped the Vietnam War. Because their daddies were rich or whatever else, had political influence and so forth. They didn't like that. So now they're coming after him. But what's fascinating is that they're still proud of the job that this empire state has done in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's amazing to me. I mean, the best evidence of how ridiculous this is? You don't see one neocon, not one single neocon, traveling to Iraq or Afghanistan for family vacation. They're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. They'll sit there and say, oh, it's a wonderful paradise. Oh, the troops have rebuilt Iraq, and oh, the troops have rebuilt Afghanistan. It's all bull. I mean, it's a delusion. But that's what they want taught in the public schools. That's what they want ingrained in the school children. It's what they want the American people to believe. It's what they want on these giant sporting events to say, let's praise the troops for what they've done in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, they killed a lot of people, and it is such a wasteland of violence and torture. In fact, there's really no difference between the Saddam Hussein regime and the Maliki regime. These are dictatorial regimes here. Maybe democratically elected, so what? It's what powers the dictatorship has. And these neocons, I guarantee you, not one is going on vacation in either Iraq or Afghanistan. Doesn't that say it all? I mean, if these were wonderful little paradises, don't you think they'd be out there, pompously saying, we brought you this? And I even read in the New York Times today that in Afghanistan, the tourists are not going there. Why? Because they're getting kidnapped by the Taliban. And the Taliban's position is that as long as you have an occupation force in this country, don't come and visit. We don't want you here as long as you have your occupation army. And of course, the U.S. has its occupation army along with, Great Britain and so forth. And think how you would feel. Let's say that the Chinese were to invade America one day. And you had Chinese troops everywhere and pompously abusing, Americans and ordering them here and ordering them there and subjecting, people to, women to searches, arbitrary searches. And there'd be a lot of resentment built up against the Chinese occupiers, right? Well, then suppose all of a sudden Chinese citizens come and start visiting and they want a tour. And, well, Americans would resent them too. And that's what's happened in Afghanistan. So I guarantee you no neocon's going to go to Afghanistan. These things have turned out to be disasters for America. They've produced this war on terrorism because of the anger and hatred that manifests itself in terrorist counterstrikes, 9/11, the USS Cole, the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center. This is where the welfare warfare state has brought us. And then the culmination is this horrible fiscal crisis that entails not insufficient taxes, but too much spending and too much borrowing. And that's where we, the American people, finally have to say enough's enough. We don't want any more debt saddled on us. We don't want any more debt saddled on our children and grandchildren and future generations. We want a stop to this. And we don't want any more trickery. We don't want trillion-dollar coins. We don't want chicanery, constitutional chicanery. And the only way to do this is to dismantle a large portion of the welfare warfare state. Now, like I say, from the libertarian standpoint, we ask what should be the role of government in a free society, and we say, well, it doesn't involve putting people in jail for drug addiction. It doesn't involve forcibly making people good. So we would separate charity in the state. We'd separate, peaceful activity in the state, drug abuse in the state, health care in the state. We dismantle the whole military empire concept, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, the CIA, the national security state, all this Cold War junk. Dismantle it. Bring all the troops home. Discharge them into the private sector, the same way that was done after World War II, which led to a huge revitalization of the economy, because you're dismantling this huge government burden on the private sector. So, yeah, be prepared for more chicanery from the statists. They're getting desperate. They're getting panicky. Their little coin tricks and their constitutional chicanery and stuff. What we've got to do as Americans and as libertarians is keep demanding that spending be constrained and preferably by dismantling illegitimate programs. Really what we need is a whole new paradigm here, a whole new framework, a framework based on individual liberty, free markets, a constitutionally limited republic. That's our heritage. It's not socialism and imperialism and statism. That's not our heritage. That's imported into this land, complement of the statists in the 20th century. What we've got to do is dismantle all this statism. That's the crux of our problem, both on the welfare state side and the warfare state side, and lead the world to genuine principles of freedom. And that's the key to economic prosperity, to harmony among people, to charity, to morality. It's the key because it involves freedom of choice. That's the show. Hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for listening in, and see you next week.